On ISP total core CapEx costs.
This is a bit of a rerun of a presentation we did at Stanford a number of weeks ago. I was hoping to get a little bit more in here than I did, but let's go through it. Okay. We've been doing some simple analysis for some of our customers. This is a glimpse at some of the key findings. You're going to have to look at the slides later, but basically what we did was, for publication purposes, we made up a topology. Our marketing department has had this network topology for quite some time. Mapped core nodes and core links onto that topology. When we gave the talk at Stanford, it was not a very IP-aware audience, so we spent a lot of time on that. This is probably very familiar. If you have, in this case, there's 66 cities that we modeled, and 18 of them were core. You have very small city-to-city traffic flows, and you obviously aggregate them into very large core traffic flows. For people in transport, that's sort of a revelation, but this is a very IP-aware group, so that's Networking 101. Okay. So now we get to the interesting part. We actually spent a real lot of time on Stanford on that. This is why I can do what was an hour there in 10 minutes here. The router costs for OC768 are, this is using, okay, a little step backwards on our methodology. We basically took a demand which was comparable to the smaller ISPs, put it on the left side of this graph, and the largest ISPs are maybe one or two tick marks into the graph, and then we scaled out the demands to take a look at how cost per bit is impacted going into the future. If you look at the left side of the graph where we have a low scale, what you'd have is if you built your whole network out of OC768, you'd have a lot of underfilled interfaces. So you'd have a dramatic drop in cost per bit as you began to fill that. The same thing's true with the transport costs. You have fiber, which is carrying very little traffic, and as you fill that capacity, you don't add it. You add very little cost as you go, and it eventually flattens out. If you were to do the same thing with 10 gigabit Ethernet, obviously you have less wasted bandwidth at the low scale. And this is all very obvious to many people here, that 10 gig costs less than 768. So if you look at the scale, you have $700 per megabit. If you look at the scale here, you've got $450 per megabit at the very far left end. And in both cases, they level out. Another way of building a network, and this is all, I'd say, fairly obvious to most people, going so far anyway, is that you can build it with layer 2, layer 3 switches with some loss of functionality. Don't let anybody from Force10 or Foundry hear me say that, but with some loss of functionality. Generally, those boxes are smaller in capacity than your core routers, and so you end up having to quickly build a class, which is a sort of like an array of routers in order to handle the capacity. You very quickly get beyond one. However, your router cost goes way down. So in this case, your transport costs dominate. In the other cases, the router costs dominate. Here the red line is the router cost and the green line is the transport cost. Again, with the OC768, it's more dramatic. Another technique we've been looking at, something that actually UUNet did way back more than a decade ago, is, and they called it IP router bypass. I'm not sure what anybody else wants to call it, but essentially, if you have enough traffic, for example, if you have parallel 10 gigabit interfaces between a chain of cities, an example is Detroit, Chicago, Denver, pick your cities. If you create a link between Detroit and Denver bypassing Chicago, even though the fiber goes past that core node, you can actually reduce the number of router interfaces and you can save some cost. It doesn't incur any additional cost in transport, so it's a net cost savings. The goal is, of course, to reduce the number of router interfaces. There's a practical limit, though, to, you could do this mathematical exercise, but in practice you can't do as much IP router bypass as an analysis like this would predict. The practical limitation is imposed by how much your traffic patterns actually change in real life. And that is measurable, but so far we don't have any measurements of it, so we can't quantify it. Today, at the current scales, only a small number of bypass links are cost effective, and due to high variability in the traffic flow, the providers that we've talked to have all told us that very few are practical. Those who are using this technique only may have anywhere from just 1 or 2 to maybe 4 or 5 bypass links in their entire network. The potential cost savings are very substantial, though. Again, prefacing this by saying that the number of bypass links that you can, in practice, put in place is limited by how much your traffic patterns change. If you are, the graph, this particular graph shows relative to doing no IP bypass what your cost savings would be. And this is total cost, so it's the transport plus the router cost. And as you can see, you've got more than a 25% gain if you were able to actually put that many bypass links in. The majority of the gain, though, is in the first 5 or 10 links. And so this really is just showing, the next plot just truncates at 30. And it just shows that you do gain a substantial amount by just putting in 5 or 10 bypass links. If you were to put in the maximum number of bypass links, you would not, even at the highest scale we have here, which is a 32 terabit coming into an IP network, which for most providers we think is at least 5 years in the future. Your savings are not tremendous, but you can potentially get a 20% savings. And even then, you're not building a full mesh. This is sort of a revelation for transport people, again, especially those people who believe in the all-optical network. They believe that you could just build a full mesh, and it just doesn't, it's not cost-effective. Even if the transport was free, a full mesh would not be cost-effective. If you were to start using a lot of IP bypass, one of the things we've noticed is your optical reach goes way up. So, for example, if you did create a bypass link from Chicago to Salt Lake City, you'd have a long way to go. This has some impact if you're considering doing optical switching, because now you have to figure in the regen costs. You also have to figure in that every optical add drop that you pass through provides a penalty. It reduces your reach somewhat. The most, how am I doing in time anyway? What am I doing? Oh, okay. The longest reach that anybody claims is 2,000 to 2,500, but we show that even that's too low. I'm going to have to skip down. I only have a minute, so. Okay, some of the other things that we're doing that I didn't show in this presentation is the impact of MPLS-TE. We haven't actually done that. There's some stuff that we did at Stanford, a couple slides on restoration techniques. It turns out that IGP restoration today is much cheaper than transport restoration, which is another revelation for transport people, not such a revelation for IP people. It's very easy to do this same sort of analysis for space and time, for space and power. I had done some analysis with DWDM and alien waves. I was hoping to be able to show it today. That would have been much more interesting than this. And there's some stuff with future technology that is in the research world that we're planning to do. We haven't done quite yet. Really, the only thing you get out of this is that 768 is a lot more expensive, even in the foreseeable future, than it's more expensive than even OC192. Any POS is much more expensive than 10 gig E. There are some people who say, "Oh, we've known that forever." Particularly the carriers are pushing for 768 anyway. The layer 2, layer 3 switches are much cheaper than routers. Everybody knows that. There are some limitations to them, though. And the other thing is that the IP router bypass can substantially reduce cost. And one of the things that we're looking for, and we're having a lot of trouble getting, is the data that would be necessary to quantify the limits to how much bypass is practical. And that's pretty much it. Thanks.
Do you have any quick questions out there? Thank you, Kirsten.